Hello guys, I'm Alex from Maximal Fire, and today I'm going to do a quick video on a Kickstarter which I've been asked to take a look at over the last couple of weeks. So a few weeks ago, a gentleman called Chris from Wargame Forge got in touch with me, and he basically asked if I would take a look at a Kickstarter that he was planning on launching. Now, this Kickstarter was for some STLs of Terrain, which were specifically based at the Adeptus Titanicus and also the Battletech market. Now, my experience of 3D printed terrain before has only ever been in resin, and I was told by Chris that these were specifically designed to be used with FDM. So I thought that this was a good opportunity to call up one of my good friends and ask if I could borrow his printer and actually take a look at what FDM printed terrain was really all about. Chris was very, very kind. He sent over 3 STLs of some of the products which are launched as part of the Kickstarter. And I sent them over to my friend Alex, who stuck them on his printer and printed them off and very, very kindly shipped them over to me in Bournemouth so that I could get my hands on them and I could do this review today. So what is the Kickstarter all about? Well, if you're a fan of the original Space Marine game, Epic, obviously a lot of people know it as, then within the box there were some very iconic cardboard and plastic buildings. Now, a lot of people have kind of aspired to that kind of aesthetic over the years, and I certainly, with the Civitas buildings from Games Workshop, designed the layout of most of my buildings to those very classic designs, you know, the crosses, the T-junction-y type buildings, to try and replicate something very similar to what I remember from Epic. But the size of the Epic models obviously was a different scale back in the day, and I've got an old copy of Epic and very quickly realised that the buildings which I'd hoped to use or reuse, breathe some new life into from the old Space Marine game, were just a little bit too small for Adeptus Titanicus. So I was very excited when Chris got in touch because these buildings immediately kind of jumped out at me as holding that aesthetic. And he's done some undamaged buildings in the past. In fact, I believe earlier on in the year or previously he did a Kickstarter for these very same buildings, but he did undamaged versions of these. And this Kickstarter, which is out at the moment, and has got, I believe, around about a week left to go till it hits its deadline, are for damaged ones. So if you backed his Kickstarters before in the past, you may well be in a very good situation whereby you can have damaged and undamaged versions of the same building, which, if you use those additional rules for Adeptus Titanicus, gives you a great option to replace those buildings when they do get destroyed or they do get damaged. But I'm strictly looking at the damaged Gothic ruins set that he's done. So as I said, this is by Wargames Forge, and it's a very, very cheap initial outlay. I had a look at some of the tierings. There's 3 initial tierings starting at $25. 2 of those are actually designed for the game Battletech. So if you're a fan of Battletech, and I know a lot of people who like big stompy robots from Adeptus Titanicus have also dabbled with Battletech as well, then what he's done is he's split out 3 initial Kickstarter tiers. One which is specifically the buildings kind of as they are, and then one with the same buildings on a hex base or hex-based base, and then another one where the buildings are slightly scaled down and also designed for the kind of Battletech size and on those hex bases again. And from there, he's also got a £35 tier if you wanted the 2 Battletech type tiers. And finally, there's a $65 version where you get everything all in. There's also a bunch of add-ons as well, which you can have a look through for various different STLs that you can purchase as part of the Kickstarter. There are 13 designs which you get as part of the initial package. Very pleased to say that he's already blown through his initial £500 minimum that he needed to get the project funded. So it's already funded, which is great news for anybody who's backed it. And he's unlocking stretch goals every $500. And at the point of recording, he'd already unlocked 5 of these and just hit the $3,000 mark, which is fantastic news for Chris. But I really wanted to kind of get the measure of what FDM printed terrain really was all about. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, I've always been a resin fan. I know it takes a long time, but the amount of detail that you can get from a resin 3D print is really incredible. So I've always been a big fan of resin. I've never really dabbled in FDM. And in the past, you know, I've had a few things printed for me, and the quality of FDM varied massively. But again, with all things, I think the technology is moving forwards. I was sent these 3 building samples, which were sent over from Chris, from my friend Alex, a couple of days ago, and I've actually finally got these in my hands. So the first thing that really struck me is not only was how bright a plastic that my friend Alex decided to print these in, but was just how fine the details actually are on these. In my head, I had kind of assumed or built up from my previous experience that the details on FDM printed terrain are very liney, and look, you know, like they have been 3D printed. And that's a stupid thing to say, but like they've been 3D printed. And I was always a bit dubious about what it would actually look like, and then maybe I was a bit of a resin snob. But the amount of detail that Chris has managed to get into these is actually pretty incredible and pretty stunning. In fact, the way that the FDM 3D prints actually is lends itself very well to the ruined segments of these buildings. Now, anybody who's printed with FDM will know that occasionally what you get is the odd strand which is going to hang low or doesn't quite adhere properly. But that actually, funnily enough, works really well with the aesthetic of a ruined building. I've got a few inside of this one, and there's a few inside of a few other ones, but what it actually does is, because of the way that it prints from the bottom up, unlike resin, which would be from the bottom down, upside down, so to speak, it looks like there are kind of hanging cables or things which have sort of fallen down from the ceiling, and it's sort of like one of those happy accidents, I think. And not to mention that the cleanup of this was actually very, very small. I was expecting there to be lots of strands of filament everywhere, and this may, of course, vary depending on what printer you're using. But apart from some filament going between some of the open windows, there was actually very, very little in the way of cleanup that I was required to do. So I was very impressed with what I saw, actually. And there was 3 versions that he sent me of various different sizing, and all of them looked really, really good. And I did take it upon myself to have a go at actually painting some of these up to see what it would look like once I'd painted it, what my experience painting it would be as well. Because I'm always in the market for new terrain. You know, we run tournaments, and so I thought maybe this might be an option of getting some more terrain printed up for Beachhead when we do that in February this year. But I want to make sure that it's easy to paint and enjoyable to paint as well, because obviously it's a time-consuming process. And I managed to print up one of the smaller ones that paint up, I should say, one of the smaller ones that he sent over to me, and it was very quick, very easy, and overall I think it looks really good. I mean, you will never get the same level of detail that you will with resin printing. You can print these in resin, although you'd need to add your own supports to the STLs. I don't believe they come pre-supported. But all I did with this particular building was a few dabs here and there of astrogranite debris basing texture, sort of around the rubbly areas to try and just to sell that kind of rubble aesthetic. And then other than that, I just painted it up exactly how I would do any of my other buildings. And like I say, really quick, really easy. and looks really, really good. I'm really impressed with how it looks. The last thing that I was interested in was sort of what sort of size this would end up looking at. Sometimes these buildings can have a tendency of being too big, or not big enough, like I found with the Space Marine cardboard and plastic buildings. So I lined these up against a Warlord, a Reaver, and a Warhound, and the scaling of them is actually very good at the sort of, well, let's say, the standard AT size STLs that you'll be getting as part of one of the $25 initial tiers. The 3 buildings that I've been sent comfortably conceal a Warlord. They come up to sort of head height. And because of the ruins, obviously, there's lots of nice areas where you can still draw line of sight from weapons to them and things. They're taller than a Reaver, or about as tall as a Reaver, so it comfortably obscures that as well. And obviously, by default, it's bigger than Warhounds. So I think that these are going to be a nice addition to the board. They're a good size. I think I'm going to need quite a few of them for a 4x4 for Adeptus Titanicus. Each one of the buildings I've got is roughly covers an area of around about 3 inches square. I know he's got some bigger ones as part of his Kickstarter, but based on that, I reckon I'd probably need somewhere in the region of 20 buildings, perhaps, to fill a 4x4. Just speculatively speaking, off the top of my head, I obviously don't have 20 of these buildings to check. But a good size for an urban battlefield, and a good amount of terrain for an urban battlefield. Obviously, you can combine this with other terrain as well, so you wouldn't necessarily need it all to be buildings. But overall, a really positive first experience for me with FDM terrain. I'm a little bit of a convert. I'm almost tempted to buy myself an FDM printer just to try and give this a go a little bit more. Might be on my Christmas presents list. We shall see. And yeah, just another kind of arrow in my quiver, so to speak, to continue my sort of terrain journey for Adeptus Titanicus. So if you are in the market for some more terrain, I would highly recommend checking out Chris's Kickstarter. I'll be putting the link, obviously, in the video description. Because this is an STL Kickstarter, obviously there's no long waits for your files. All of the initial Kickstarters have already been designed, and so they will be available, I believe, a few weeks after the Kickstarter ends. And if you don't happen to make the Kickstarter, then he also does sell the stuff he's done before, and these will go on to the same site to buy them after the Kickstarter. I will also put a link in the video description of his store, so you can check out his other stuff and have a look at the unruined versions of these buildings as well. So there you go. Really impressed, really happy to get my hands on some new stuff. Kind of quite excited to maybe get myself a new board of terrain printed up. So there you go, guys. I hope this has been useful. And if you do like AT terrain and you do like Battletech terrain, then I think that this is something that you should probably check out. So thanks very much for tuning in again, and I will see you all again next time.